Members of the jury, ladies and gentlemen of this solemn court, imagine a world where justice stands as the unbreakable pillar of our society. A world where the scales tip not toward power, influence, or defiance, but toward truth, morality, and the protection of the innocent. Today, we gather not merely in a courtroom, but in a sanctuary of accountability, where the echoes of lost lives demand to be heard. Look at the evidence before you, the lives shattered, the families torn apart, the arrogance that believed it could bury secrets forever. We stand here to confront the darkness that lurks in human nature, the belief that one can outsmart the law, mock the grieving, and smile in the face of unspeakable horror. Justice is not vengeance. It is the moral compass that guides us through chaos. It reminds us that no one, no matter how confident, how theatrical, how convinced of their own superiority, is above the reach of truth. Morality demands we protect the vulnerable, the young, the innocent who look up to figures of authority only to be betrayed in the cruelest ways. Members of the jury, as we present this evidence, remember the weight on your shoulders. You are the guardians of justice. Imagine the silence in a mother's heart when her sons vanish. Imagine the terror in young eyes pleading for mercy. This is not just a trial. It is a reckoning with the soul of humanity. Let us proceed with reverence, with resolve, and with the unwavering pursuit of what is right. Feel the gravity of these moments, the profound tragedy that unfolded in the streets and hidden corners of Louisville, Kentucky, in 2016. A story of admiration twisted into fear, loyalty corrupted into terror, and lives extinguished in the pursuit of silence. Members of the jury, let us now turn to the evidence in this case, a chilling exhibit of arrogance, control, and betrayal that shook the city of Louisville in 2016. At the center stands Bryce Rhodes, a local aspiring rapper known in some circles as Rambo, who projected an image of power and charisma that drew in the young and impressionable. He was a figure some teenagers in the community admired deeply, someone who bought them food, clothes, and drove them around in his car, fostering a sense of loyalty, excitement, and belonging. These young people saw him as a mentor, a big homie who might elevate them, perhaps even make them part of his music world, giving them a glimpse of fame and success in a life that often felt limited. Rhodes believed himself smarter than everyone around him, smarter than investigators, smarter than the courts, smarter than the very system designed to hold him accountable. He carried himself with an unshakable confidence, convinced that his secrets were buried deep, the evidence erased, the voices silenced forever. But look closer, members of the jury. The truth has a way of rising, no matter how deeply one tries to inter it. The story begins with a fatal mistake that set off a chain of unimaginable violence. In early May 2016, Rhodes, operating under the mistaken belief that there was a bounty on a certain man's head, a rumor circulating in the shadows of the streets, spotted 40-year-old Christopher Jones walking along the street. Jones was simply a man going about his day, a father of two with his own struggles and dreams, unaware that he had been misidentified as a target. Rhodes, riding in a car occupied by several teenage boys, including 14-year-old Larry Ordway, an honors student brimming with promise, a young life full of potential and innocence, and his 16-year-old half-brother Maurice Reese Gordon suddenly leaped from the vehicle. In a moment of cold calculation, he allegedly fired shots that struck Jones, ending his life in a senseless act of violence born from paranoia and error. The brothers, who had looked up to Rhodes as that influential big homie, someone who could perhaps guide them toward a brighter future through his music and street savvy, suddenly found themselves unwilling witnesses to cold-blooded murder. The admiration they once felt curdled into fear, a deep, gnawing terror that shattered their sense of security. In the aftermath, the boys confided in their mother, seeking protection and guidance in a world that had abruptly turned nightmarish. They shared what they had seen, a desperate plea for safety from the horror that had unfolded before their young eyes. Imagine the psychology at play here. Members of the jury, the vulnerability of youth, the trust placed in an older figure who seemed to offer excitement and opportunity, now revealed as a source of mortal danger. Rhodes learned of this conversation. To him, these young boys, vulnerable, trusting, still clinging to the remnants of their idolization, represented an unacceptable threat. He could not tolerate loose ends in his carefully constructed facade of invincibility. Weeks later, driven by this paranoia, he lured Larry and Maurice to his apartment under false pretenses, promising perhaps more time together, more of that illusory camaraderie that had initially drawn them in. Present that evening were several other young men, teenagers caught in the same web of influence and fear, including close associates like Anjuan Carter, then just 15 years old, and others such as Ja'Cory Taylor and Tyron Coleman. They were hanging out in the apartment, smoking, drinking, a gathering that on the surface appeared casual, almost normal for young people seeking escape and connection. But beneath it all, tension simmered like a storm-gathering force, an undercurrent of dread that none could fully articulate. An argument erupted, not between the brothers initially, but involving Maurice Gordon picking up a knife in an aggressive manner during a heated dispute with one of the others, referred to as Corey. Rhodes intervened swiftly, seizing the knife from the boy's hand, smacking him across the face, and declaring with chilling authority that he would violate him, a term implying severe punishment, domination through pain. Maurice, still viewing Rhodes as the big homie, perhaps went along in that moment, believing it would only amount to a minor punishment, a punch, a slap, nothing irreversible. But members of the jury, imagine the psychological dynamics unfolding. A grown man, in his mid-20s, exerting absolute dominance over teenagers who had once idolized him, twisting their loyalty into a paralyzing fear, manipulating their admiration into submission. The brothers were then separated from the group, locked away in the bathroom, while those in the living room, under Rhodes' unmistakable direction and control, engaged in something unimaginable. They took a vote. A deliberate, cold vote on whether Larry and Maurice should live or die. Rhodes orchestrated it, calling for hands to be raised or voices to speak in favor of death. Most in that room, gripped by terror and the overwhelming pressure of the moment, voted yes to death. Only one, Anjuan Carter, voted no, a fleeting, courageous moment of conscience amid an atmosphere thick with intimidation and dread. Consider the emotional weight of that vote. Members of the jury, young lives hanging in the balance, decided not by law or mercy, but by a show of hands in a dimly lit apartment, influenced by one man's iron grip on the group. What followed was methodical, calculated horror that reveals the depths of depravity and control. Sheets were deliberately laid out on the floor, not haphazardly, but purposefully, to catch the blood, to contain the mess, to facilitate the moving of bodies afterward. This was no spontaneous act of rage. It was planned, premeditated evil. Maurice was brought out from the bathroom first. His hands were tied behind his back with a belt, rendering him helpless. A sock was stuffed deep into his mouth to muffle any cries for help or pleas for mercy. A hat or bag was placed over his head to blind him, stripping away his sight and heightening his terror in those final moments. He was forced to his knees, vulnerable and alone. Rhodes began the assault with brutal fists to the chest, pounding with force that echoed the betrayal of trust. Then, accepting a knife passed to him, he stabbed repeatedly, into the torso, chest, stomach, again and again in a frenzy of violence. Maurice struggled desperately, trying to make noise through the gag, muffled grunts of agony escaping as he fought for breath, for life. But the socks silenced him effectively, and he struggled until his body went still, until he stopped breathing. Blood soaked into the prepared sheets and seeped into the carpet, though not in the torrents one might imagine in such savage acts. A grim detail that underscores the intimacy and control of the killing. Then, it was Larry's turn. The younger brother, just 14, full of promise as an honor student, was brought out next. He saw the blood-soaked spot on the floor where his beloved brother had just been slain, realized in that heartbreaking instant the full horror awaiting him, and fought desperately, kicking wildly, straining against his bound hands in a frantic bid for survival. Already gagged with a sock and blinded by a covering over his head, similar to his brother, he could make only muffled noises as the stabbing began. Rhodes stabbed him extensively, repeatedly, relentlessly, far more times than necessary, until the young boy's life ebbed away. Imagine the emotional depth here, members of the jury. A 14-year-old boy, seeing his brother's blood, knowing his fate, fighting with every ounce of strength against the man he had once admired. In a chilling display of forced complicity designed to bind everyone in shared guilt, Rhodes then passed the knife. To ensure that no one could ever speak without implicating themselves, he demanded participation from the others. Anjuan Carter, the one who had voted against death, was forced to stab the already lifeless body of Larry 3 times, his hands trembling under the weight of coercion. The knife was passed to others, like Jacori, who stabbed a few times as well. This was psychological bondage at its most insidious, binding these young men in guilt, ensuring their silence through the damning knowledge that they had all touched the blade, that they were all part of the irreversible act. Members of the jury, pause and reflect on the profound emotional depth of these moments. These were best friends to some present in that room, brothers in the loose sense of street camaraderie, young lives full of potential and dreams. In their final moments, they may have pleaded silently or through muffled sounds, perhaps one invoking little brother or some term of endearment in a vain hope of mercy from the man they had called Big Homie. One boy begged not to be harmed, invoking brotherhood in a desperate appeal to the remnants of loyalty. But Rhodes, in full, unchallenged control, gave orders, expected unquestioning obedience, and showed no flicker of remorse. Afterward, the threats came swift and severe. Look him directly in the eyes, he warned the survivors, and remember, if anyone ever spoke of this, they wouldn't make it out alive. The fear was palpable, a chain that bound them tighter than any physical restraint. The cleanup was equally calculated, a further exhibition of cold efficiency. The bodies were placed carefully into large totes for transport. Rhodes and some of the others drove to an abandoned house in a desolate area, a place forgotten by the city, and set the bodies ablaze, pouring accelerant to ensure they burned fiercely, rendering them scorched and unrecognizable when eventually discovered. The intent was clear: destroy any remaining evidence, erase the physical traces of the crime. Anjuan Carter stayed behind at the apartment, scrubbing blood from the floors and walls all through the night, traumatized beyond words, fearing constantly for his own life if he resisted or fled. He later reflected on his years of silence. Overwhelming terror, nowhere safe to turn, the conviction that any resistance would lead to the same gruesome fate as the brothers. Rhodes' arrogance only grew in the wake of what he perceived as impunity. There were no security cameras capturing the acts, no immediate eyewitnesses coming forward to speak out, scant physical evidence at first glance. He insisted on his innocence publicly, claiming he was being targeted unfairly by authorities. Weeks stretched into months, months into years, and his confidence manifested in shocking ways during the long road to trial. By the time the trial commenced in 2023, after years of delays compounded by the pandemic and Rhodes' own disruptive behaviors, his hubris was on full display. Members of the jury, exhibit after exhibit, captured Rhodes smirking directly at the grieving families seated in the gallery, interrupting proceedings with outbursts, arguing defiantly with the judge in ways that stunned observers. In one particularly revealing exchange preserved for the record, the judge admonished him for his inappropriate smiling amid such grave proceedings. "And I don't know why you're smiling." Rhodes replied without hesitation, "Because I can." The judge warned that it didn't help his case, that it irritated people with so much at stake. Rhodes retorted boldly, "It's not a crime to smile. I'm allowed to smile. I'll do what I want to do." He performed as if the courtroom were his personal stage, theatrical outbursts requiring intervention from officers, open mockery of the victim's profound pain. To observers across the nation following the case, it revealed not merely a defense strategy, but raw hubris. A man utterly convinced that his charisma and intimidation would ensure no one would ever betray him. But the walls began to close in, slowly but inexorably. Behind closed doors, Anjuan Carter wrestled intensely with his conscience over the years. Traumatized by the events, carrying the heavy burden of guilt for his forced participation and his prolonged silence, fearing deadly repercussions, yet haunted relentlessly by the memories of that night, he reached a profound breaking point, acknowledging to himself, "I've carried this for too long. I feel guilty. I wish the outcome was different." In December 2023, Carter took the stand in court, his voice steady despite the weight, detailing the unrelenting terror, the orchestrated vote, the bindings with belts and gags with socks, the blindfolds, the repeated stabbings, the meticulous cleanup, the burning of the bodies, the chilling threats that followed. His testimony was personal, raw, and utterly damning, transforming years of speculation and circumstantial evidence into irrefutable, heartbreaking truth. Other co-defendants, including Ja'Cory Taylor, corroborated the accounts in key details, painting a consistent picture of Rhodes as the driving force, the mastermind who forced their involvement. The prosecution rested its case on this foundation of testimony and supporting evidence. The defense challenged the credibility of these witnesses, pointing to their own involvement and plea deals, but the jury saw through to the core truth. Members of the jury, on December 18, 2023, after careful deliberation, the verdict was read aloud in that packed courtroom. Guilty on all charges. 3 counts of murder for the deaths of Christopher Jones, Maurice Gordon, and Larry Ordway, tampering with physical evidence, and abuse of the corpses of the teenage brothers. Each juror affirmed the decision when polled, a unanimous stand for accountability. In the penalty phase that followed shortly after, victim impact statements poured forth from the families. Christopher Jones' brothers speaking of lost futures, the grandmothers of Larry and Maurice breaking down over the tragic theft of their grandsons' lives. Rhodes' own family testified in mitigation, speaking of his difficult childhood and traumas, but the jury recommended, and the judge ultimately imposed in March 2024, multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never walk free again. Anjuan Carter, for his eventual cooperation despite his role in the cover-up and cleanup, received a 10-year sentence with the possibility of rehabilitation, the judge noting that his delayed but courageous truth-telling still played a vital role in delivering justice. This was no ordinary conviction. A man who had mocked grieving families, defied the court with smiles and outbursts, believed himself utterly untouchable, ultimately shattered by the voice of truth from those closest to him, those he thought he had bound forever in silence. Members of the jury, this case probes the deepest recesses of human nature, the allure of power corrupting absolutely, drawing in the young and vulnerable with promises of excitement only to ensnare them in fear. The fragility of youth trusting the wrong figures, idolizing those who exploit rather than uplift. The immense courage required to break years of enforced silence and speak truth to power. It reminds us that the law is not perfect, but it is persistent, a steadfast beacon piercing the darkest corners of human behavior. Arrogance blinds those who wield it, convincing them of invincibility even as evidence mounts. Conscience, though buried under layers of fear and guilt, can illuminate the path to redemption and justice. Justice, though delayed for years in this case, ultimately affirms morality's quiet but inexorable triumph over defiance and depravity. In the end, we must confront ourselves as a society. What shadows lurk in our communities that allow such betrayal of trust? How do we better protect the vulnerable, the young seekers looking for guidance in a complex world? This courtroom, this mountain of evidence, demands that we choose light over darkness, truth over silence, protection over exploitation. Thank you for weighing this evidence with the gravity it deserves. Justice has spoken, not in vengeance, but in the moral restoration of balance. The innocent are remembered, the guilty held accountable, and society reminded of its sacred duty to safeguard the fragile flame of humanity.